My wife handed me divorce papers on Christmas Day. Then her entire family started cheering. But when she opened my gift, her face went pale, because inside was... Jack had always believed in the quiet power of traditions. As a senior accountant at a mid-sized firm in Minneapolis, he led a life that was, by all appearances, structured and predictable. He woke up each morning at 6 o'clock, prepared his usual breakfast, 2 slices of toast, a boiled egg, and black coffee, and commuted exactly 25 minutes to his office. Yet, behind his veil of routine was a man whose heart beat with quiet hope, especially as December rolled in. This Christmas felt different, not because of the snow that dusted the sidewalks earlier than usual, nor because of the unusually soft carols echoing from the radio. It felt different because, for Jack, it carried a fragile weight of expectation. After nearly a year of emotional distance, he was hoping, depending on, the holiday to rekindle something between him and Emily, his wife of 7 years. Their marriage hadn't always been this way. Jack still remembered the first Christmas they spent together as newlyweds, tangled in lights while trying to decorate their tiny apartment tree. He remembered how Emily used to hum while baking gingerbread, her voice blending into the cinnamon-sweet air. But over the past year, that hum had faded. Conversations grew shorter, smiles more forced. Nights were spent on opposite sides of the bed, the silence between them too loud to ignore. And yet, Jack had chosen to believe that love, like the season itself, could be reborn. Emily's family had extended an invitation to spend Christmas Eve and Christmas Day at their house, a 2-story home nestled in a quiet suburb not far from the city. Jack had never felt entirely at ease around them. There was always a subtle formality in the air, as if he were a guest being politely tolerated rather than warmly embraced. Still, he accepted the invitation with hope, maybe surrounded by holiday cheer and family warmth. Things could shift. On the morning of December 24th, Jack took care in packing their suitcases. He included a thick wool scarf Emily had once complimented in passing, and he wrapped her present with meticulous attention, a small blue box, tied with a golden ribbon. It sat silently in his coat pocket, waiting for its moment. He didn't know exactly what impact it would have, only that it carried the best of him inside. The drive to Emily's family home was quiet. She stared out the window for most of the trip, her fingers occasionally tapping on her phone, responding to messages. Jack kept his eyes on the road, glancing occasionally at her reflection in the glass, wondering if she too felt the tension, or she had simply grown used to it. They arrived around noon. Emily's parents, David and Karen, greeted them with warm smiles and polite hugs. Her younger sister, Sarah, beamed, while Rachel, her cousin, gave Jack a courteous nod. The house was already alive with the scent of roasted turkey, pine-scented candles, and laughter coming from the living room. Children darted between rooms with wrapped boxes. The television played an old Christmas movie, and the fireplace crackled softly. Jack helped unload the car and carried the gifts inside. He placed them carefully under the tree, noting the contrast between his neatly wrapped box and the glittery, oversized packages that surrounded it. That small box seemed almost shy among the louder, flashier displays of holiday spirit. Throughout the day, Jack tried to make conversation, laughed at appropriate times, and even helped Karen in the kitchen. Emily, meanwhile, floated effortlessly among her relatives, always seeming just out of his reach. It was like watching someone you once knew from across a crowded room, familiar yet distant. That night, after the family dinner, Jack and Emily were given the guest room on the 2nd floor. As they settled in, he looked at her and said softly, "Thanks for inviting me this year." She nodded, not meeting his gaze. It made sense, she said. He wanted to ask what that meant, but instead said, "I hope tomorrow feels like old times." Emily turned off the bedside lamp without replying. On Christmas morning, the living room buzzed with excitement. Children unwrapped presents with shrieks of joy, and adults exchanged hugs and cups of coffee. Jack handed out a few gifts, carefully selected weeks in advance. He had always prided himself on thoughtful giving. His gift to Karen was a rare cookbook she once mentioned in passing. To David, a leather-bound journal for his wine tastings. They both thanked him with genuine surprise. Emily stood by the tree, a large red envelope in her hand. She called Jack's name and held it out to him with a calm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "This one's for you." Jack took the envelope, confused by the lack of festivity in the gesture. It felt too formal, too clinical. Still, he opened it, expecting perhaps a letter, a memory, or even a heartfelt note. What he found was a crisp stack of papers clipped neatly together, divorce documents. For a second, Jack stared, blinking slowly. His fingers tightened slightly around the edges of the pages as he skimmed the first lines. It was real, legal language, filing details, signatures. He looked up, not at Emily, but at the family around them. Some looked away. Others smiled, softly, awkwardly, as if uncertain whether they should applaud or stay silent. In the middle of it all, with laughter still echoing from the children nearby, Jack held the envelope in one hand and reached into his coat pocket with the other. He pulled out the small blue box and walked toward Emily. Emily didn't reach out to take the box. She just looked at it, eyes fixed on the gold ribbon that Jack had tied with such care. The room had grown quiet, as if some unspoken understanding had passed through the space and dimmed the holiday spirit. Even the youngest children, unaware of the full weight of what was happening, had hushed their giggles and leaned against their parents' arms, sensing that something adult and serious had taken over the morning. Jack remained still, his hand extended. The box looked impossibly small now, almost absurd against the backdrop of such a monumental moment. After what felt like an eternity, Emily finally took the gift, her fingers brushing his for just a second. It was not an affectionate touch. It felt like a transaction. "Thank you," she said, softly, though her tone betrayed no gratitude. He didn't reply. He simply nodded once and stepped back. She looked down at the box, hesitated, then untied the ribbon and opened it. There was no jewelry, no key to a car, no dramatic gesture meant to win her back. Instead, nestled inside the blue velvet interior, was something entirely different, a bound booklet, its cover made of soft linen paper, the title embossed in gold, "The Year I Stayed." Emily furrowed her brow. She lifted the small book and flipped it open. Her lips moved as she read the first few lines silently, but then she froze. Her fingers stopped turning the pages. For a moment, she didn't breathe. Jack stepped aside, allowing her the space she clearly needed. He didn't watch her reaction directly. He was too aware of the dozen eyes flicking between them, unsure whether they were witnessing a breakdown or a breakthrough. David shifted in his chair and cleared his throat, but no one spoke. Not even the television dared to break the silence. Sarah, sitting near the fireplace, leaned slightly forward, watching Emily with intensity that bordered on concern. Rachel looked at Jack, but he kept his gaze on the floor, his hands folded in front of him, unmoving. Emily slowly sank into the armchair behind her, the booklet open in her lap. She read for several minutes, saying nothing. The others began to move again, distracted by children or conversation. But the energy in the room had shifted entirely. Jack did not attempt to retrieve the papers she had given him. They remained on the coffee table, their presence sharp and awkward. Eventually, Karen approached Emily and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Sweetheart, are you all right?" Emily nodded but didn't answer. She closed the booklet gently and set it on her lap, her eyes far away, not on her mother or anyone else. She looked like someone who had just remembered something they were trying very hard to forget. Jack took a slow breath. Then, with calmness that surprised even himself, he turned to Karen and David. "Thank you for having me. I know this wasn't easy. I'll get my things." Karen opened her mouth as if to say something, but nothing came. David stood up, clearly unsure whether to shake Jack's hand or not. He opted for a short nod. As Jack ascended the stairs, he heard Sarah stand and follow behind him. He paused at the guest room door, turning only when she was close. "I didn't know," she said quickly, before he could speak. "About the divorce, about the timing. None of it." Jack gave a small, tired smile. "You don't need to apologize." "No, I do," she insisted. "You didn't deserve that. Not today. Not like that." He nodded again, and for a moment, it looked like she wanted to hug him, but she didn't. Instead, she stepped aside and let him pass into the room. Jack packed quickly. His suitcase was already half full, but now his hands moved with more certainty, as if completing a task helped quiet the noise in his mind. He zipped it up, took one last look at the space, and walked out. At the bottom of the stairs, Emily was still sitting, the booklet now closed on her lap. She looked up as he passed. "Why did you write it?" she asked, voice quiet. Jack didn't stop walking. "Because I thought maybe you'd forgotten the parts that mattered." He didn't wait for a reply. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, light and soft, like a curtain being drawn over the world. Jack walked down the driveway, suitcase in hand, not knowing exactly where he was headed. But somehow, the cold on his skin felt more honest than the warmth he had just left behind. He didn't drive straight home. Instead, he found a coffee shop still open on Christmas morning, parked his car, and went inside. The place was mostly empty, save for a few college students and a man in a red flannel shirt reading a newspaper. Jack ordered black coffee and found a corner table near the window. He pulled out his phone, not to scroll or distract himself, but to breathe. For the first time in a long while, he felt no need to chase clarity. The gift had been given. The message had been heard. Whatever came next wasn't his to control. 2 hours later, he received a text from an unknown number. "Hi, Jack. It's Rachel. I hope you're okay. Just want to say that was one of the most human things I've ever seen. Your gift, the way you handled everything. I'm sorry it had to happen this way." Jack read the message, then locked his phone and took another sip of his now lukewarm coffee. In the quiet hum of the cafe, he allowed himself to feel the weight of disappointment, not as a punishment, but as proof that he had loved sincerely. And in that recognition, there was a strange comfort. He didn't feel angry. Not yet. He just felt still. When he finally stood to leave, the snow had thickened. As he stepped outside, the cold air rushed into his lungs and made him feel, for the first time that day, fully awake. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew he was no longer clinging to a version of the past that only he remembered, and that, in itself, felt like the first step toward freedom. By the time Jack returned to his apartment later that evening, the streets were empty. Christmas lights flickered on windowsills, but the quiet was so complete that even the faint buzz of electricity felt amplified. He walked to the front door, dropped his keys into the bowl by the entrance, and let the suitcase fall softly to the floor. He didn't bother turning on the lights. Instead, he stood in the dimness of the hallway, just breathing. The apartment was just as he had left it, clean, organized, and cold. He hadn't put up a single decoration that year. There hadn't seemed to be a point. For weeks, he had focused all his energy on the gift for Emily, believing, perhaps naively, that it might reach her in a way nothing else had. He walked to the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water. The silence inside was only occasionally interrupted by the faint creak of old pipes or the wind brushing against the windows. It was still Christmas Day, but it felt like the holiday had passed somewhere else entirely. Later that night, around 10 o'clock, his phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from Sarah. "I stayed after you left." Emily read more of the booklet. Not out loud, but everyone could tell. "I think it hit her harder than she expected. Just thought you should know." Jack stared at the message for a long time before setting the phone down. He didn't reply. There was nothing to say, at least not yet. 2 days passed without any further contact. Jack returned to work quietly, sitting at his desk as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. His co-workers exchanged holiday stories, commented on traffic and leftover turkey sandwiches, but Jack remained distant, not withdrawn, just quieter than usual. On the third day, a knock sounded at his door. He wasn't expecting anyone. No deliveries. No appointments. When he opened it, he found Emily standing in the hallway, holding the blue box in both hands. She didn't smile. She didn't look angry or emotional. She simply looked tired. "I thought you might want this back," she said, holding out the box. Jack looked at it for a moment. It wasn't meant to be returned. She hesitated, then lowered the box. "I read all of it." He nodded. "I figured." She stepped inside without being invited, as if muscle memory had taken over. Jack stepped aside, not resisting. She walked the middle of the room, turned slowly, and looked at the space. It had been theirs once, even if only briefly. "I don't know what I expected," she said. "From you. From the divorce. From Christmas, I guess." Jack remained near the door. "What did you feel reading it?" Emily ran her fingers across the top of the box. "Sad. Mostly. Guilty, too. You were right in some things you wrote. I stopped trying. I convinced myself that you had stopped, too, and that made it easier not to look at my part in it." Jack walked to the kitchen, opened a cabinet, and pulled out 2 mugs. "Want tea?" She nodded. He set the kettle to boil and began preparing 2 cups, still listening. "I never thought you'd actually say anything," she continued. "You always let things slide. That's what I told myself. That you just accept it. Quietly." "I did," he said. "For a while. But I couldn't pretend I was okay with it forever." "I know," she said, barely above a whisper. The kettle whistled. Jack poured the hot water, handed her a mug, and sat across from her at the kitchen table. "I wasn't trying to shame you," he said. "I know," she replied again. "That's what made it worse. You were just honest." Jack sipped his tea. "I should have talked to you sooner," Emily said. "Not just about the divorce. About all of it. The distance. My resentment. The parts of me that changed and I didn't want to admit." Jack didn't offer comfort. He let the silence stretch, allowing her words to sit in the space between them. "Your gift," she added after a pause, "was probably the most painful thing I've ever received. But it was also the most truthful." He looked at her directly for the first time since she'd arrived. Then it did what it was meant to do. Emily's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. "I'm not here to fix things," she clarified. "I know we're past that. I wanted you to see that I read it, that it wasn't wasted." Jack nodded. "I never thought it was." She stood slowly and looked around one last time. "I'll send the final papers next week. You can review them when you're ready." "All right." At the door, she turned back. "I hope you find someone who sees you the way you deserve to be seen." He gave a small, weary smile. "Me too." When the door closed behind her, the apartment felt even quieter than before. That night, Jack sat at his desk and opened a blank document on his computer. He wasn't sure why. The booklet had taken months to write, carefully compiled from scraps of paper, journal entries, and voice memos. But now, something urged him to continue. Not for her, but for himself. He typed the date, paused, then wrote a single line. December 28th. The first day I didn't feel invisible. He didn't know what the rest would say yet, but it felt like a beginning. The morning after Emily's visit, Jack sat at his kitchen table staring at the small blue box she had left behind. She had taken the booklet with her when she left, but the box itself remained, placed neatly in the middle of the table as if daring him to open it again. He reached for it, untied the ribbon, and let the lid slip open. Inside was nothing now, just the soft lining where the booklet had rested. But it wasn't empty, not really. The weight of what had once been inside still lingered in the air, almost louder than the silence of his apartment. He picked it up, studied the velvet fabric, then closed it again. What had been inside the box was never meant to be a trap or a weapon. It was a mirror, a way for Emily to see what he had seen, to feel what he had felt. Whether or not she admitted it, Jack knew it had unsettled her. Her visit had been proof enough. And yet, as he sat there, he realized that the gift had also been for him. It had allowed him to release his truth into the world, no longer carrying it alone. That realization gave him an idea. Later that week, Jack returned to his office. The post-holiday lull had set in, and his co-workers dragged themselves through spreadsheets and year-end reports with glazed eyes. Jack, however, found himself more focused than usual. During his lunch break, instead of eating in the cafeteria, he pulled out his laptop and began retyping portions of the booklet. Not to give back to Emily, not this time. He was creating something new, an expanded version of his reflections, almost like a journal but structured more intentionally. By the end of the day, he had nearly 20 pages. He printed them out, stapled them together, and slipped them into a plain folder. When he looked at the folder sitting on his desk, he didn't feel the heavy ache of loss. He felt something closer to release. That night, He carried the folder to a small community center 2 blocks from his apartment. He had passed it dozens of times before, but never gone inside. A flyer on the door announced a weekly group session for people navigating divorce or separation. Jack hesitated in the cold, snow gathering on his coat, before finally pushing the door open. Inside, a circle of chairs was already forming. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes welcomed him. "First time here." Jack nodded. "Take any seat you like. We just talk. No pressure." When it was his turn to introduce himself, he simply said, "My name's Jack. My wife and I, well, she's not my wife anymore. It's recent." There were sympathetic nods, but no prying questions. Later, when the discussion opened up, Jack found himself pulling out the folder almost without thinking. "I've been writing about the last year," he said. "Not to hold on to it, but to understand it. Would it be all right if I shared something?" The group encouraged him, and so he read a few passages, pieces about small moments he had cherished, his attempts to bridge the distance, the silence he had endured. When he finished, there was a pause, then a murmur of recognition. Several people spoke up, saying they had felt the same in their own lives. For the first time, Jack felt his words weren't just for Emily. They were for anyone who had ever struggled with love that slipped away. After the session, one man approached him. "That was powerful," he said. "You should think about putting it all together. People need to hear things like that." Jack thanked him, though he didn't know if he believed it yet. The following weekend, he received another unexpected message, this time from Rachel. "Hey, I know this might be strange, but I can't stop thinking about what you did on Christmas. Would you like to grab coffee sometime? No pressure." Jack read the message twice before replying. "Sure, I'd like that." They met at a quiet cafe near the river. Rachel arrived bundled in a wool coat, her cheeks red from the cold. She greeted him warmly, and for a moment Jack felt surprising ease, as if they had known each other longer than they actually had. "I wanted to ask you something," Rachel said once they were seated. "Why a booklet? Why not just a letter?" Jack thought about it. A letter would have been too short, too easy to dismiss. "I needed her to see the year the way I saw it. Day by day, moment by moment, not just one big speech, but all the small things that mattered." Rachel nodded thoughtfully. It was brave, painful but brave. They talked for nearly 2 hours, not just about Emily but about work, books they enjoyed, places they traveled. For Jack, it was the first genuine conversation he'd had in months that wasn't weighed down by unspoken tension. When they parted ways, Rachel squeezed his hand gently. "I'm glad you said yes." That night, back at his apartment, Jack reopened the blank document he had started. He typed for hours, adding new chapters, weaving in reflections from the support group, conversations with Rachel, and memories that still lingered in the back of his mind. The box on his table remained empty, but in a way, it was no longer empty at all. It had become a symbol of something greater, the place where honesty lived. And every word he now wrote was filling that space again. Not for Emily this time, but for himself. By the time midnight struck, Jack had written over 40 pages. He leaned back, exhausted but strangely fulfilled. The gift he had once given away was slowly becoming a gift to himself, a record of survival, resilience, and the simple truth that love, even when it ends, can still shape you into someone stronger. And though he didn't know what Rachel's role in his future might be, he knew this. The small blue box had opened something far bigger than he ever imagined. It had opened the possibility of starting over. The first days of January arrived with their usual weight of new beginnings, though for Jack the turn of the calendar felt more like a continuation than a restart. He still carried the quiet echoes of Christmas with him, but something had shifted, subtly, yet enough to make him notice. His evenings were no longer consumed with silence for its own sake. Instead, he filled them with words, writing and rewriting fragments of his reflections, letting them grow into something larger. One Thursday evening, as he was returning from work, he found an envelope slipped under his apartment door. The handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, deliberate, Emily's. He carried it to the kitchen table and sat for a long moment before opening it. Inside was a single letter. Jack, I've read the booklet again. Slowly this time, not just in pieces. I don't know why I feel compelled to tell you this, but I think it's because the words won't let me rest. They replay themselves whenever I'm quiet. You always had a way of noticing the smallest things. The mornings I left my coffee half finished. The nights I stayed up too late on my phone. I told myself you didn't see them, but you did, and you carried them like little stones in your pocket, one after another, until the weight was too heavy. I don't know how to reconcile what I feel now. I don't want to undo the decision I made, but I also can't deny that your words have forced me to look at myself in ways I avoided for years. I suppose I wanted you to know that you were heard. Maybe not in the way you hoped, but in a way that will change me forever. Emily. Asterisk. Jack read the letter 3 times. The words did not surprise him, but they settled in his chest with a heaviness he couldn't ignore. She hadn't changed her mind, but she had read. She had allowed herself, even for a moment, to be still with his truth. The following weekend, Jack attended the support group again. This time, he didn't bring the folder. He listened instead. A man in his 50s spoke about the loneliness of an empty house after 30 years of marriage. A young woman described the difficulty of explaining divorce to her parents, who still believed in fairy tale unions. Jack nodded quietly, feeling both connected and apart. His story had its own contours, but the silence he had known was something they all understood. After the session, Sarah was waiting outside the building. Jack froze when he saw her, unsure of how she even knew where he was. She offered a nervous smile. "Rachel told me," she explained quickly. "Don't be mad at her. I needed to see you." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Here." "Yes, here," she said, wrapping her scarf tighter around her neck. "I want to tell you something. After you left on Christmas, I picked up the booklet. I read some of it. Not all, but enough. It made me think about things in my own life, about how often I push people away without realizing it. I guess I want to say thank you." Jack was quiet, caught between gratitude and discomfort. "I didn't write it for anyone else." "I know," she said, "but sometimes what we create ends up belonging to more people than we expected." Her words lingered in his mind long after she left. That night, back at his apartment, Jack pulled out the letter from Emily again and placed it beside Sarah's words in his memory. Both women, in their own ways, had been reading him silently. They hadn't responded with loud gestures or promises. They had simply absorbed the weight of his honesty and reflected it back to him. Later, Rachel called. "I heard Sarah found you," she said, laughing lightly. "She did," Jack replied. "She's not wrong, you know. Your writing, it reaches people, even the ones you never meant it to." Jack sighed. "I didn't think I'd ever want to be seen that way. But maybe that's changing." "Let it change," Rachel said gently. Over the following weeks, Jack continued writing, but now with less urgency. The words flowed naturally, no longer driven by the need to convince or prove, but simply to understand. He began meeting Rachel for coffee regularly, their conversations stretching into long walks by the river, sometimes about life, sometimes about nothing at all. One evening, she asked if she could read some of what he'd been writing lately. He hesitated, the old instinct to guard his words rising quickly. But then he handed her the folder. She read silently, her brow furrowed in concentration, her lips moving slightly as she traced each line. When she finished, she closed the folder carefully. "You write like someone who wants to be remembered," she said. Jack looked at her, caught off guard. "Is that bad?" "No," Rachel said. "It's beautiful, but it means you can't keep hiding away." Her words reminded him of Sarah's and of Emily's letter. Everyone, it seemed, was reading him silently, each in their own way. And maybe that was the point. His words had left his private world and entered theirs, carrying something more than he intended. That night, Jack placed the blue box back on the table. It no longer held a booklet, but it still represented something larger. The act of giving, of sharing truth even when it hurt. He realized then that the gift had never really been about Emily alone. It had been about teaching himself to stop living invisibly. The silent readings, Emily's, Sarah's, Rachel's, were proof that his words mattered. And for the first time, Jack wondered if perhaps his story wasn't just a closed chapter of a marriage, but the beginning of something far more enduring. The middle of January carried with it a particular kind of heaviness, one that seemed to mirror Jack's own state of mind. Snow covered the streets in thick, uneven piles, and the air was sharp, almost metallic. Life had resumed its normal rhythm for most people after the holidays. But for Jack, nothing about his days felt entirely ordinary anymore. He still went to work, still kept his apartment neat, still made his morning coffee at 6 o'clock sharp. Yet beneath those routines there was a restless undercurrent he couldn't quite settle. It came to him most often at night. After writing for hours, he would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying conversations, Emily's voice reading the words he had written, Sarah's admission that his story made her reflect on her own life, Rachel's encouragement that his words shouldn't stay hidden. Each time, he felt both gratitude and unease. Gratitude that they had listened, and unease at the weight it placed on him. His thoughts had never been meant for an audience. They were fragments of his pain, yet they had become mirrors for others. One Friday evening, he accepted Rachel's invitation to join her and a few friends at a small dinner gathering. It was the first social event he had attended in months that wasn't tied to family or obligation. The apartment was warm and filled with laughter, the kind that bubbled easily without restraint. Rachel introduced him simply as a good friend, and though the words were casual, Jack noticed a slight pause before she said them. At the table, someone asked him what he did for a living, and Jack answered plainly, accounting. The conversation moved on quickly, but later, one of Rachel's friends asked about his hobbies. Jack hesitated. He writes, Rachel interjected with a smile, and not just a little. He writes with heart. The attention turned to him again. What do you write about? The friend asked. Jack paused, glancing at Rachel, who looked at him encouragingly. Mostly reflections. About relationships. About what it means to stay when things get difficult, even when it feels easier to leave. The group grew quiet for a moment, and Jack worried he had brought the mood down. But then one of them nodded slowly. That's brave. Most people avoid those topics. Later that night, walking Rachel home, Jack admitted, I don't know if I like people knowing I write. It feels too vulnerable, like I'm exposing pieces of myself I can't take back. Rachel looked at him. But isn't that the point? To stop hiding the pieces. Her words lingered in his mind long after they parted. The following week, Emily's letter remained on his desk. He hadn't replied. Part of him wondered if he should, if silence might come across as indifference. But another part of him resisted the idea of giving her more words than he already had. After all, she had left. She had chosen distance. Shouldn't he choose the same? Yet, he couldn't deny that her acknowledgement, her silent reading of his truth, had unsettled him in ways he hadn't expected. It wasn't reconciliation he craved, but clarity. And clarity was rarely comfortable. One evening, while revising his writings, he stumbled upon an entry he had nearly forgotten. It was dated in early spring of the previous year. Today she laughed at something I said. It wasn't forced, and it wasn't polite. It was real. I don't even remember the joke. I just remember the sound. I think I will hold on to that longer than she ever will. Reading it again, Jack felt the sting of bittersweet memory. That single sentence seemed to capture the entire paradox of their marriage. The fleeting moments of light, surrounded by long stretches of quiet distance. He closed the folder and leaned back in his chair, realizing that some truths were more painful in hindsight than they had been in the moment. The next session at the community group brought a different kind of challenge. The facilitator, a woman named Margaret, asked everyone to share not just their stories of loss, but their part in it. It's easy to talk about what was done to us, she said. Harder to admit what we did ourselves, even if it was just in silence. Jack hesitated. He wanted to believe he had done everything he could, but as the circle moved closer to him, his chest tightened. When his turn came, he spoke slowly. I let things go too often. I thought keeping the peace was more important than addressing what bothered me. I thought patience would fix things. But maybe patience just made me invisible. No one judged him. Instead, there were quiet nods, some tearful, some solemn. He realized then that the reflection he feared most wasn't Emily's judgment or Rachel's admiration. It was his own recognition that he hadn't only been a victim of neglect. He had been a participant in silence. That night, back home, Jack couldn't sleep. He stood by the window, watching the snow fall under the dim glow of the streetlight. For the first time, he admitted aloud to the empty room, "I should have spoken sooner." The words hung in the air, heavy but liberating. By the end of the month, Jack had filled over 100 pages with reflections, some painful, some hopeful, all deeply personal. Yet, he sensed that the more he wrote, the more questions surfaced. He was learning that healing wasn't about tying things up neatly. It was about sitting with the discomfort long enough to let it transform into something else. And so, the uncomfortable reflections remained. They were no longer just about Emily or about the past. They were about him, about who he had been, and who he was becoming. For the first time, Jack began to see that the story of the box and the booklet was not the end of his marriage. It was the beginning of his reckoning with himself. The end of January brought with it a series of unexpected invitations. Jack found himself hearing from people he hadn't spoken to in years, old friends, co-workers, even distant relatives. Most messages were casual, New Year greetings sent late, but each one reminded him of how much his life he had spent in the background, quietly holding things together without ever drawing attention to himself. Now, however, it felt as if his quietness had been pierced. It wasn't just the letter Emily had sent or Sarah's admission after Christmas. It was something larger, something that seemed to ripple outward from the moment he had chosen to place that booklet in Emily's hands. His words, once muffled by years of silence, were now echoing in ways he hadn't expected. One Saturday afternoon, Jack decided to visit the public library. He hadn't been there in years, but the urge to find a quiet corner away from his apartment pulled him in. As he walked through the aisles, he passed a table where a group of high school students were working on a project, their voices hushed but energetic. He remembered himself at that age, always a quiet observer, rarely the speaker. The thought made him smile faintly. He carried a few books on memoir writing to a desk near the window. As he flipped through them, a voice interrupted his focus. "Jack!" He looked up to see Rachel standing there, holding a stack of novels. Her face lit up when she saw him. "I didn't know you came here." "I haven't in a long time," he admitted. "Thought I'd try something different today." She sat across from him, lowering her books to the table. "I come here often. It's quieter than coffee shops. Less distraction." Their conversation slipped easily into a rhythm. Rachel spoke about her work in nonprofit management, about the challenges of balancing passion with practicality. Jack listened, occasionally sharing his own reflections about accounting, about how he sometimes wondered if numbers had been a safe way to avoid dealing with emotions for so many years. After a while, Rachel noticed the books in front of him. "Memoir writing?" she asked with curiosity. Jack hesitated, then nodded. "I've been thinking, maybe my writing isn't just for me anymore. Maybe it could become something larger." Rachel leaned forward, her voice softening. "I think it already is. You just don't see it yet." Her words echoed in his mind long after they parted. The next week at work, Jack's supervisor asked him to stay after a team meeting. He braced himself for some discussion about performance or deadlines, but instead his supervisor said, "You've seemed different lately, more focused, but also quieter. Is everything all right?" Jack considered his response carefully. For years, he had kept his personal life separate, never letting his colleagues glimpse beyond the polished surface. But now, something in him resisted the old instinct to stay silent. "I've been going through some changes," he said honestly, trying to figure out what comes next. His supervisor nodded. "If you ever need flexibility, let me know. Life doesn't always follow our schedules." It was a small gesture, but Jack left the meeting feeling lighter. His voice, even when muffled, was beginning to be heard. That weekend, the community support group met again. Margaret, the facilitator, asked each person to describe what they wished they had said but never did. When it was Jack's turn, he paused, the room waiting in silence. Finally, he said, "I wish I had told her sooner that I felt invisible. I thought patience was the same as love. I thought silence was kindness. But silence can be cruelty too, even if you don't mean it to be." The words hung in the air, and Jack felt a strange mix of vulnerability and strength. He had said out loud, not just on paper, For once, the muffled voice was clear. After the session, Margaret approached him privately. "You have a gift, Jack. The way you put feelings into words. It makes people listen. Have you thought about sharing your story more publicly?" Jack shook his head. "I wouldn't know where to start." "Start small," she advised. "Maybe write an article, or even share a passage with a larger group. Sometimes the words we're afraid to say are the very ones people need to hear." That night, back in his apartment, Jack sat at his desk and stared at the blue box once again. He opened it, still empty, yet full of meaning. He thought of all the times he had swallowed his words over the years, choosing peace over confrontation, quiet over truth. The box had carried his silence once, but now it seemed to ask for something else. His voice. And so he began drafting something new. Not for Emily, not even for himself this time, but for others. A piece that spoke of silence, of muffled voices, of the quiet ways relationships erode when people stop truly seeing one another. It wasn't bitter, nor was it vengeful. It was simply honest, as his booklet had been. By the time he finished, dawn was beginning to break, the pale light stretching across his desk. Jack read the words aloud softly, his voice filling the room. For once, there was no audience, no reaction. Just his voice, clear, steady, unafraid. It was enough. And though he didn't know where those words would go yet, he knew this much. The muffled voices of his past had finally begun to give way to something louder, something real. The first week of February arrived with a subtle change in rhythm. The snowstorms that had blanketed the city for weeks finally began to ease, revealing patches of frozen sidewalks and the first hint of thaw. Jack's life was steady, almost deceptively so. Days spent at work, evenings filled with writing, weekends shared between quiet reflection and the support group. Yet beneath the surface, something was shifting. One evening, as he was leaving the community center after another group meeting, he noticed Sarah waiting outside. She was bundled in a thick coat, her breath visible in the cold air. When she saw him, she gave a tentative wave. "Do you have a minute?" she asked. Jack was surprised but nodded. "Of course." They walked together down the block, the crunch of ice under their boots filling the silence until Sarah finally spoke. "I've been meaning to talk to you," she said. "About Emily, about Christmas, about all of it, really." Jack kept his gaze ahead. "You don't owe me anything, Sarah." "I know," she admitted. "But I still feel like I should. You see, Emily and we're different in a lot of ways, but we grew up together, and I know how she thinks. She always wants to look like she's in control, like every decision she makes is the right one. But I could tell, even on Christmas, that your gift broke through that. She's been quieter ever since." Jack didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure what to make of Sarah's openness. "She told me later," Sarah continued, "that reading your words felt like standing in front of a mirror she didn't want to face. She didn't tell me the details, but I could see it in her eyes. It shook her." Jack sighed. "I didn't give her the booklet to shake her. I gave it to her because I needed her to see what I saw. That's all." Sarah glanced at him. "Maybe that's exactly why it mattered. You weren't trying to expose her. You were just telling the truth." They stopped at a small park, its benches dusted with snow. Sarah sat, brushing the frost off the seat beside her, and Jack reluctantly joined her. "Emily and I argued about it," Sarah admitted. "She thinks you made her look small in front of everyone. But I told her it wasn't about that. I told her it was the first time I'd ever seen you stand up for yourself, not by shouting, but by being honest. She didn't like hearing that from me." Jack gave a small, humorless laugh. "I doubt she liked hearing it from anyone." Sarah looked down at her gloves, fiddling with the seams. "I guess what I'm saying is, I admire you for it. I don't think I could have done the same in your place." Jack tilted his head. "Why not?" "Because I avoid conflict," Sarah confessed. "Always have. I let people walk over me just to keep the peace. Watching you that day, I realized silence isn't the same as kindness. It can be its own form of cruelty, like you said at the group session." Jack was caught off guard. "You were listening?" She smiled faintly. "Rachel told me about the group, and I went once. I didn't join the circle, just listen from the back." "You didn't see me." Jack felt a strange warmth at her admission. You didn't have to do that. I know, but I wanted to understand. And hearing you speak, it made me think about my own life, about how often I let things slide with people I love, and how that doesn't actually help anyone. The silence between them this time wasn't heavy. It was thoughtful, almost companionable. Emily won't admit it, Sarah said after a while, but she's been reading that booklet over and over. I can tell. The pages are worn already. She acts like she's finished with it, but she keeps going back. Maybe she's not ready to face what it really says, but she will eventually. Jack exhaled slowly, watching his breath curl into night air. That's between her and herself now. I've already said what I needed to say. Sarah nodded, and maybe that's enough. Maybe it's not about what she does with it, but about the fact that you finally gave your voice a place to live. They sat in silence for several minutes, the city around them muted and distant. When they finally stood, Sarah touched his arm lightly. I know it might feel strange, but I'm glad we had this talk. You're not just Emily's story anymore. You're your own. Jack gave her a small nod. Thank you, Sarah. As he walked home afterward, Jack couldn't shake the conversation. It wasn't Emily's reaction that echoed in his mind now, but Sarah's. Her honesty had startled him, not because of what she revealed about her sister, but because of what she revealed about herself. That night, he returned to his desk, opened his document, and began writing again. This time, he wrote about muffled voices, not just his own, but Sarah's, Emily's, perhaps even Rachel's. He wrote about how silence can stretch across generations, across families, shaping choices and relationships without anyone realizing until it's too late. For the first time, his reflections weren't bound only to his marriage. They were expanding outward, touching on the universal ways people fail to speak until silence becomes unbearable. And as the words poured out, Jack realized something important. His story was no longer just a private journal. It was becoming something larger, something that belonged not just to him, but to everyone who had ever stayed quiet when they should have spoken. It was, in its own way, a conversation, a dialogue carried in silence, waiting to be heard. It was mid-February when Jack received Rachel's message. She had kept her words brief, as though uncertain how they might land. Are you free this weekend? I'd like to see you again. Jack read it twice before replying. Their last conversation at the library had left him thoughtful, her encouragement echoing in the back of his mind. He had not been sure whether to interpret her presence in his life as coincidence or something more deliberate, but now it was clear she was choosing to remain in his orbit. On Saturday afternoon, they met at a small cafe overlooking the river. The snow had begun to melt into slush, and the air carried that damp chill of late winter. Rachel was already seated when he arrived, a book open in front of her. When she looked up, her smile was immediate and warm. I'm glad you came, she said as he settled across from her. Me too, Jack admitted. They ordered coffee, and for a while, their conversation drifted toward easy topics. Work frustrations, favorite books, the oddities of Minneapolis winters. Yet beneath the surface, both of them seemed to sense that the meeting carried a weight that wasn't entirely casual. At one point, Rachel closed her book and leaned forward slightly. Can I ask you something personal? Jack nodded. What do you want now? Not in the sense of work or routine, but in life. After everything. Jack hesitated. It was a question he hadn't allowed himself to answer. I want peace, he said finally. Not the kind that comes from silence, but the kind that feels alive. I want to stop living like a ghost in my own life. Rachel studied him for a moment, then smiled gently. That sounds like a beginning, not an end. They lingered in the cafe for hours, the world outside blurring into background as they shared stories of childhood, regrets, and half-forgotten dreams. For Jack, it felt almost strange to laugh freely, to feel seen without the weight of judgment or expectation. When they finally stepped outside, the city was awash in the orange glow of evening. Rachel pulled her coat tighter and walked beside him toward the parking lot. Would you want to do this again? She asked, her voice careful but hopeful. Jack gave a small, certain nod. Yes, I would. Over the next several weeks, their meetings became more frequent. Sometimes it was coffee, Sometimes long walks along the river, sometimes quiet evenings where they read side by side, without needing to fill the silence. Jack noticed how natural it felt, the absence of tension that had defined so much of his marriage. Rachel didn't demand answers from him, nor did she shrink from his truths. She simply listened, and in return offered pieces of herself. One evening in early March, Rachel invited Jack to her apartment for dinner. It was a modest space, cozy and lined with bookshelves. She cooked pasta while they talked in the kitchen, the scent of garlic and basil filling the air. After they ate, they sat on her couch, the quiet between them comfortable. "I need to tell you something," Rachel said, her expression thoughtful. "When I saw what happened on Christmas, when Emily handed you those papers and you gave her that box, I realized something about myself. I've spent so much of my life avoiding people's pain. I thought it was easier to keep things light, to never get too close. But you showed me that sometimes the only way to truly connect is to face the uncomfortable parts. That's why I wanted to see you again, because I don't want to avoid things anymore." Jack was silent for a moment, moved by her honesty. "That's all I've been trying to do. Face the uncomfortable parts, even when it hurts." Rachel reached out, her hand brushing his lightly. "Then maybe we can face them together." The word stayed with him long after he left her apartment that night. Meanwhile, Emily remained present in his life, though not directly. Sarah occasionally mentioned her in passing, usually in the context of how quiet she had become, how introspective. Jack listened without asking for details. He no longer felt the need to chase answers from her. She had her own reflections to wrestle with, just as he had his. One evening, however, as Jack was leaving work, he saw a familiar figure waiting near his car. Emily. She stood with her hands tucked into her coat pockets, her expression unreadable. "I didn't know where else to find you," she said when he approached. Jack kept his voice calm. "What is it?" "I just wanted to say," she trailed off, searching for words. "I've been reading the booklet again. I know I don't have the right to keep bringing this up, but it won't leave me alone. The things you wrote, they've forced me to see who I was in ways I didn't want to admit." Jack nodded but didn't reply. Emily looked at him with something between regret and relief. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I'm listening now, even if it's too late." There was a time when those words would have shaken him, would have reopened every wound. But standing there in the cool evening air, Jack realized he no longer carried the same weight. He had spoken his truth, and it had been heard. Whether Emily understood it fully or not was no longer his burden. "I hope you find what you're looking for," he said simply. Emily's shoulders slumped slightly, but she nodded. "I hope you do, too." As she walked away, Jack felt a strange calm wash over him. The reunion he had never expected had come and gone, leaving him with no anger, no longing, just closure. That night, when he sat down to write, his words were different. They no longer circled around loss or silence. Instead, they reached forward, exploring the possibility of new beginnings, of voices that were no longer muffled but steady and clear. And though he didn't yet know where Rachel would fit into his story, he knew this much. The reunion that mattered most wasn't with Emily, but with himself. March stretched into its final days with the promise of spring in the air. The snow that had blanketed Minneapolis for months was finally giving way to puddles and damp sidewalks, the gray sky occasionally splitting to reveal the brightness of a sun people had nearly forgotten. For Jack, the change in weather mirrored the subtle but steady changes within him. He felt lighter, as though the heavy layers he'd been carrying were slowly peeling away, one by one. Yet moving on was not a single decision made in a moment of clarity. It was a series of choices, repeated each day, often quietly. He realized this on a Sunday morning when he found himself reorganizing his apartment. For months, the space had remained in stasis, unchanged, as though he'd been waiting for permission to move forward. But now he boxed up old things he no longer needed. Clothes Emily had once picked for him. Souvenirs from trips they had taken, small tokens that held more weight than they should. He did not throw them away with bitterness, but with a calm acceptance. They were relics of a chapter closed. Later that week, during another session at the community group, Jack shared something he hadn't spoken aloud before. "I've been waiting for a clean break, a moment when everything would feel finished. But I don't think it works that way. Moving on isn't about waiting for the past to disappear. It's about choosing not to carry it into the future. The group nodded. Several members visibly moved. Margaret, the facilitator, offered a smile. That's one of the hardest lessons to learn. You're not erasing the past. You're reshaping how it lives inside you. Jack left the session with a sense of quiet conviction. He knew now that he had to take deliberate steps forward, even if they were uncomfortable. The first step came unexpectedly when a colleague at work mentioned an opening at a branch office in Denver. They're looking for someone experienced in managing audits, the colleague said. It could be a good move. Different pace, different city. At first, Jack dismissed the idea. Moving states felt drastic, almost like running away. But later that night, sitting at his desk, he couldn't shake the thought. Denver, a city he had visited only once years ago, but remembered for its mountains and open air, a place where he could start fresh, away from the echoes of Emily and her family, away from the streets that still carried the weight of memory. He brought it up to Rachel during one of their walks. What would you think if I considered leaving Minneapolis? Rachel was quiet for a long moment. Would be for me to answer that, she finally asked. Jack shook his head. No, it would be for me, but I wanted to hear what you thought. She stopped walking, turning to face him. I think, if you feel like you finished your chapter here, then you should go. Starting over doesn't have to mean forgetting. It just means giving yourself the chance to live differently. Her words stayed with him. That weekend, Jack sat down and wrote a letter. Not to Emily, not to Rachel, but to himself. He wrote about the man he had been during the marriage, about the silence he had kept, about the courage it had taken to finally speak. He wrote about the pain of that Christmas morning, about the box, about how it had set him free in ways he hadn't expected. And then he wrote about what he wanted now. A life that was no longer defined by what he'd lost, but by what he could still build. The letter ended with a single line. I choose to move forward, not because I must, but because I can. With that, the decision crystallized. He applied for a position in Denver. The process was quick. His experience made him an ideal candidate, and within weeks he received confirmation that he was accepted. When he told Rachel, they met again at the river, sitting on a bench where they had often talked. She listened carefully, her expression unreadable at first. So you're really doing it, she said quietly. Yes, Jack replied. I need to. Rachel nodded slowly. Then I'm happy for you. Truly, you've been carrying so much, and maybe this is the clean slate you deserve. Jack hesitated. I don't want to lose what we started. You won't, Rachel said firmly. Distance doesn't have to erase connection. It just reshapes it. We'll figure it out. Her confidence steadied him. In the final days before his move, Jack visited places he had once shared with Emily. Restaurants, parks, even the quiet bookstore downtown where they used to browse on weekends. But instead of sorrow, he felt something closer to gratitude. These places no longer belonged to their marriage. They were his again, reclaimed, part of his story without the weight of her absence. On the evening before his departure, he packed the last of his belongings. The blue box sat on his desk, still empty, yet filled with meaning. He debated leaving it behind, but something urged him to take it, not as a reminder of Emily, but as a symbol of what he had learned, that truth once spoken could never be taken back, and that even the most painful gifts could become sources of strength. When the movers loaded the final boxes into the truck, Jack stood for a moment in the empty apartment. Sunlight spilling across the bare floor, he whispered a quiet farewell. Not to Emily, not even to Minneapolis, but to the version of himself who had once lived here in silence. Then he locked the door and walked into the cold March evening, his decision clear. Jack was moving on, not because the past was erased, but because the future was finally waiting. Jack's first weeks in Denver were marked by a disorienting mix of unfamiliar streets, towering mountains in the distance, and a silence that was different from the one he had known in Minneapolis. This silence was not heavy or suffocating. It was wide, open, and full of possibility. He threw himself into his new role at the firm, finding comfort in the predictable structure of numbers and deadlines, while outside the office he began to explore the city in small, deliberate steps. One Saturday morning, as sunlight streamed to the blinds of his new apartment, He found an envelope tucked into his mailbox. There was no return address, only his name written in the familiar slant of Emily's handwriting. For a moment, he considered leaving it unopened. He had made his decision to move forward, and the past no longer dictated his days. But curiosity, mixed with a lingering sense of unfinished business, urged him to open it. The letter was handwritten, several pages long. He carried it to his small kitchen table, sat down with a cup of coffee, and began to read. Jack, by now, I assume you've moved on in more ways than one. I've heard through Sarah that you left Minneapolis, and I imagine that's what you needed. I don't know if writing to you is selfish, but I feel like I owe you this, even if it comes too late. Your booklet has stayed with me. I read it until the pages wore thin. At first, I told myself I was angry that you had made me look weak in front of everyone. But the truth is, I wasn't angry with you. I was angry with myself. I didn't realize how much of you I had stopped seeing. How many times I dismissed your attempts to reach me. How many nights I chose distraction over connection. I convinced myself that we were simply drifting apart, when in reality I was pulling away. You gave me a gift I didn't want but desperately needed, a mirror. Every word in those pages reflected the person I became, not the person I wanted to be. I know nothing I say now can undo what happened. I don't expect reconciliation, but I want you to know that your honesty changed me. For the first time in years, I've started asking myself who I want to be, not just in a marriage, but as a person. I am deeply sorry, Jack, not just for how I ended things, but for how I let them erode so quietly. You deserve better from me. I hope Denver gives you the peace you've been searching for. I hope you keep writing, because your words carry more than pain. They carry truth. Emily. Jack set the letter down, his hand steady. He read it again slowly, this time allowing himself to feel the weight behind her words. There was no anger in him, no longing for what could have been, only a deep, quiet recognition that Emily had finally faced a mirror he had held up for her. Later that evening, he called Sarah, who picked up quickly. I wondered if you'd get her letter, she said. So you knew, Jack replied gently. She asked me for your address, Sarah admitted. I didn't know if I should give it, but I thought maybe you deserved to hear her out one last time. Jack leaned back in his chair, staring out at the fading light beyond his window. I'm glad you did. It doesn't change anything between us, but it matters that she said it. Sarah was quiet for a moment before saying, She's different now. Not completely, but she's trying. I think your words started something in her she couldn't ignore. Jack gave a small nod, though she couldn't see it. Then maybe it was worth it. That night, he sat at his desk and opened his laptop. He typed out parts of Emily's letter, not to preserve her apology, but to reflect on what it meant. He wrote about how closure doesn't always arrive in the form we expect. Sometimes it comes not when the other person asks forgiveness, but when we realize we no longer need it. The following week, Jack attended a local writing workshop he had signed up for on a whim. The group gathered in a small bookstore, each person bringing a piece to share. When it was his turn, he hesitated for only a moment before reading an essay he had written about the gift he gave on Christmas, the blue box, the booklet, the silence it broke. When he finished, the room was quiet. Then one woman spoke softly. That's not just your story. That's all of ours in some way. The group murmured in agreement, and Jack felt the same quiet recognition he had felt at the support group back in Minneapolis. His words had traveled farther than he had ever intended, reaching people who had never known Emily, never known him, but who understood the truth within the story. Later, as he walked home under the clear Denver sky, he thought of Emily's letter once more. Her words were no longer a tether to the past, but a marker of how far he had come. She had faced her reflections, and he had faced his. Their stories would no longer overlap, but each would carry the lessons of what had been. Jack slipped the letter into the blue box that night, not as a keepsake of Emily, but as a final piece of closure. The box was no longer just a gift given. It had become an archive of transformation, of words spoken and heard, of truths faced. And for the first time in years, Jack felt not just peace, but gratitude. Gratitude that the silence had been broken, that the muffled voices had been heard, and that the echoes of the past had finally settled into stillness. Spring came late to Denver, but when it finally arrived, it carried with it a brightness Jack hadn't felt in years. The snow that once weighed down the city melted into rushing streams, and the mountains revealed themselves in green and gray, sharp against the sky. For Jack, the change of season mirrored the changes within him. He was no longer living in the shadow of what had been. He was beginning to live in the presence of what could be. His new life unfolded not in dramatic leaps, but in quiet, consistent choices. He joined a community running group that met on Saturday mornings, something he had never considered before. At first, he struggled to keep pace, his breath heavy in the thin mountain air, but the encouragement of strangers soon turned into camaraderie. They were people who didn't know his past, who didn't measure him against Emily or against the silence he had once carried. They only knew him as Jack, the man learned to run again, not just on the trails but in life, at work. He found himself taking on projects with a confidence that surprised even him. In meetings, he spoke with clarity, no longer worried about keeping his thoughts to himself. His supervisor noticed, offering him opportunities to lead smaller teams. "You have a way of listening that makes people want to follow," she told him one afternoon. Jack smiled, realizing that what had once made him feel invisible, his tendency to listen more than speak, had now become one of his greatest strengths. Rachel remained part of his life, though distance stretched between them. They spoke often, sometimes daily, their conversations weaving between the mundane and profound. She visited Denver once in late April, and the reunion was marked not by hesitation, but by ease. They spent a weekend exploring the city, hiking trails, and sharing quiet meals. On her last night there, as they sat on his balcony overlooking the lights of the city, Rachel turned to him. "You're different," she said. "How so?" Jack asked. "You used to carry everything like it was too heavy to put down. Now you look like someone who knows how to let go." Her words settled into him with warmth. "Maybe I finally learned that letting go doesn't mean losing. It just means making space for what's next." Rachel smiled, her hand brushing his. "Then I hope I get to see what's next for you." After she left, Jack continued to build his life in Denver. He volunteered at the local community center, helping with financial literacy workshops for families. It was something small, but it connected him to others in a way he hadn't expected. People came to him with questions, with worries about budgets and debts, and he realized that offering guidance gave him a sense of purpose beyond numbers on a spreadsheet. One evening, after a particularly long session at the community center, he returned home to find the blue box still on his desk, the letter from Emily resting inside. He opened it briefly, not to dwell on the past, but to remind himself of how far he had come. Then he closed it gently and placed a new page inside, the letter he had written to himself weeks before. Together, they felt like bookends, one marking the end of marriage, the other marking the beginning of a life reclaimed. As spring deepened, Jack began writing more seriously, no longer just reflections for himself, but essays he shared with the writing workshop. His words resonated, and soon the facilitator encouraged him to submit to local publications. To his surprise, one of his essays, about the power of honesty in relationships, was accepted by a regional magazine. When he saw his name in print, Jack felt something he hadn't in a long time: pride. Not because of recognition, but because his voice had found its way into the world without fear. The essay caught Rachel's attention, too. She called him the day it was published. "You're not just moving on, Jack," she told him. "You're moving forward. There's a difference, and you found it." Her words lingered with him long after they hung up. By early summer, Jack had woven himself into the fabric of Denver. He had friends to call, routines to keep, a sense of belonging that didn't depend on his past. On the longest day of June, he joined his running group for a sunrise trail, the city glowing beneath them as the first light touched the mountains. As he reached the top, breathless but exhilarated, he looked out across the vast horizon and felt an overwhelming sense of freedom. This, he realized, was a sincere new beginning, not defined by loss, not shaped by silence, but built on choice, resilience, and the courage to speak. For the first time in years, Jack wasn't just surviving. He was living. The year turned slowly, and before Jack realized it, December had arrived once again. Denver was draped in lights, its streets lined with wreaths and the sound of carolers echoing from corners of busy markets. Unlike the Christmas of the year before, which had carried shock and heartbreak, this season arrived without the weight of expectation. For Jack, it was not about reclaiming something lost, but about fully stepping into the life he had rebuilt. His apartment had changed too. The shelves, once empty, now held books, photos, and small tokens of the months he had spent rediscovering himself. On the corner of his desk sat the familiar blue box, but it no longer carried sorrow. Instead, it had become a container of beginnings. Inside were not just Emily's letter and his own, but pages from essays he had published, notes from Rachel, and even small reflections he wrote on scraps of paper when inspiration struck. It was no longer a symbol of silence broken, but of a life reshaped. As Christmas approached, Jack received an invitation from one of his running friends to join a community dinner held downtown for those spending the holiday away from family. He accepted, not because he felt lonely, but because he wanted to share the day in the company of those who, like him, were building their own circles of belonging. The evening of the dinner, the hall was filled with warmth. Volunteers served roasted turkey, cranberry sauce, and steaming mugs of cider. Children ran between the tables with paper crowns on their heads, and the sound of laughter filled the air. Jack found himself seated with a mix of new and familiar faces, people he had met through running, writing, and the community center. During the meal, a young man at his table turned to him. "I read your essay last month," he said, "the one about honesty. It made me think about my own marriage. I haven't been brave enough to say the things I need to yet, but your words, they gave me courage to start." Jack felt a quiet gratitude. He had never imagined that his reflections, once meant only for Emily, would ripple outward this far. "I'm glad it helped," he replied. "Sometimes saying the hard thing is the kindest thing we can do, for ourselves and for others." Later that night, as the dinner wound down, Jack stepped outside into the crisp air. The city glowed with holiday lights, and in the distance he could see the faint outline of the mountains, their peaks dusted in snow. For the first time in years, he felt the season not as a burden, but as a celebration of resilience. The following day, Rachel arrived in Denver. She had planned the trip weeks in advance, and Jack had been quietly looking forward to it. When she stepped off the train, bundled in her coat, Jack felt an ease in her presence that warmed him more than the scarf around his neck. They spent Christmas Eve together in his apartment, decorating a small tree he had bought at the market. It was nothing elaborate, just a few ornaments, strings of white lights, and a star on top. But as they stood back to look at it, Rachel smiled. "It's simple," she said, "but it feels like home." On Christmas morning, they exchanged gifts. Rachel gave Jack a leather-bound journal, its pages blank and waiting. Inside the cover, she had written, "For the words yet to be written and the truths still waiting to be spoken." Jack gave her a framed photo of the Denver skyline at sunrise, taken during one of his runs. Beneath it, he had written a small note, "For the mornings yet to come." They spent the rest of the day cooking together, walking through the snowy streets, and returning to the warmth of his apartment to watch the lights on the tree flicker softly. There was no grand revelation, no dramatic confrontation, only the quiet certainty that life had shifted, and that he was living in a place where peace and possibility could exist side by side. That night, as Rachel dozed beside him on the couch, Jack looked across the room at the blue box resting on his desk. He thought back to the Christmas morning a year ago, when he had opened an envelope that shattered the life he thought he had, and how he had responded with a gift that revealed not anger, but truth. The contrast between then and now was stark. A year ago, he had stood in a room where voices were muffled, where his honesty was received with shock. Now, he was in a room filled with warmth, where his voice was no longer hidden but shared, where his words had found their place not just in his own life, but in the lives of others. Jack understood then that moving on had never been about forgetting Emily or erasing the past. It had been about honoring what had been true, letting it transform him, and carrying that truth into the life he was building. The next Christmas had arrived, and with it came not just peace, but gratitude, for the pain that had forced him to speak, for the silence that had taught him its cost, and for the new beginnings that had made him whole. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt the season fully. It was not just Christmas, it was renewal, and as the snow fell softly outside, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be,